But can you actually scroll up, Jacob, on this? There is a there we go. There's the figure 17 that shows these distinct ranges. Mobile buck 297 there.
Yep.
It is really wild how different the mobile buck and the sedentary buck are. Just, and I want to point out that each of these individual ranges is over a mile wide. Like these extremely dense clouds of buck beds or buck activity, buck day to day. That's over a mile wide. And this one is right on a mile wide. If you include these outliers, it's maybe, exactly a mile wide. This one's well over a mile wide. So even the buck that's quote unquote sedentary is kind of running almost a completely mile diameter circle.
Yep.
And that is not the conventional wisdom. A lot of people are thinking that's his bed or that's his spot. And I just think that's a complete misunderstanding, is that these bucks, like you just said, Luke, are keyed in on a specific time of year being in that bedding. So when you find a bed, it really means figure out why the buck's there and what incentives he's using, and let that tell you when to target him in that bed. Not that he's always using it.
Yeah, and kind of to that point, if y'all want to get into bedding areas, I'm totally fine with that. But to your point on that being a buck's bed, I have looked at over 30,000 buck beds, what we kind of call a bedding bout, over the last year or so, kind of working on the buck bedding project. And I'm not going to say that there are not bucks that use the same depression in the leaves multiple times. I'm sure there are, but in the vast majority of buck beds that pop up on a GPS map that we're looking at are not in the same depression in the leaves. They might be in the same 20 to 50 yard area. That's not too uncommon. Like, especially when a buck has his favorite areas to bed in, his favorite bedding area, there could be quite a few beds in a fairly tight area, but it is rare to see beds pop up in the same exact spot multiple times. They'll usually be like on the same ridge or in the same interior bend of a river. You know what I mean? But oftentimes, I mean, their favorite bedding areas are many acres in size.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's really good to keep in mind. I feel like some of the guys that are quote unquote bed hunting, they will say bed as in singular, but most of the time they're referring to like a buck's like core bedding area, and they're hunting that core area. There are actually very, very few examples I know of guys hunting a buck on a particular bed and being successful. Our buddy Jake Bush, I don't know if you know who Jake Bush is, Luke, but he's kind of a master here of these Ohio hills. He actually just killed a 178-inch like mainframe 8-point like last month. Absolutely insane. But he's one I know he's targeted bucks on specific beds in specific situations and has gotten it done on Boone and Crockett class bucks. But I think that's a very individual, like a buck to buck basis and a very specific situation basis.
Yeah, and I think he's using every single time he has told one of those stories and showed it on film. It's been using your woodsmanship to decide when that bed is active.
Mm-hmm.
Luke, like you said, going into the hunt, using your woodsmanship, reading the sign, and then determining whether that is the bed being used or not. And it might be a bed or a bedding area, but I think those situations work well in extreme terrain, whether that be terrain that is very, very steep and begets, maybe a few options, we'll say, that are for the particular advantages that deer have. Sometimes steep terrain that is very rough provides a lot of options for bedding. I've found that in the marsh country of southeastern Wisconsin, bedding is more consistent per the area than it is in the hills of southwestern Wisconsin. Just because a lot of it's underwater, and the times that you find a buck being consistent is usually when it's flood season and there's one tamarack root ball that's out of water and he's got to go 600 yards to get to the next one. Now, often the scenarios you run into is there's beds absolutely everywhere. There's terrain and cover absolutely everywhere, right? And it's harder and harder and harder to key in on them. But the areas and the situations that I've seen Dan and the other people in my area most successful on a bed hunting strategy are when it is that unique island that is out in the middle of nowhere, and often it doesn't have a tree by it, because if it has a tree, there's usually a stand in it. Um, and yeah, I would say that it's very important. This is why I'm really curious about the terrain applications with bedding and stuff like that, and rut movement and things like that. It's because it's really dependent on what behavior is going to beget that deer surviving in the terrain he's in. And I would venture to say that in open terrain that's flat farmland and has small chunks of woods, it wouldn't be conducive to his survival to be running around in daylight on a cut cornfield every day. So there, I think terrain might influence it a bit, and I'm really curious to see how that changes.
Yeah, I would love to have the resolution of GPS data. When I say that, I mean just the like as often as we have GPS points. We've got 96 GPS points per day for all of these bucks. You know what I mean? Throughout the course of the hunting season, every 15 minutes. So I would love to have that same resolution of GPS data in a landscape that looked very different from Mississippi, whether that's like, central Appalachia in the Ridge and Valley region of Virginia, or in the hills of Ohio, or, I mean, you name the place. I think it would be awesome to look at that in somewhere with a lot more topography, because we get questions all the time on when we post something on social media, and people be like, oh, let us see the topography. And on some properties and some bucks home ranges, there's a fair amount of topography, and I'm not going to say that deer are not using topography. I mean, I'll see in very flat country, I'll see deer walk preferentially walk a ridge that's 2 feet above everything else. It's barely a ridge, but I mean, they will walk that ridge.
Yeah.
But the topography that I think a lot of people are thinking of, I mean, it's really difficult to see on a topo map, because you kind of have to know what the landscape looks like to be able to interpret the topo map, because there's just so few lines on it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I found in Nebraska. There was a lot of people were commenting on the videos. Like, I got on a deer that I spotted from 1.1 miles away. I watched him disappear behind a hill and just not come out from behind it. So I assumed he bedded. And I got within 25 yards of this buck. But when I'm shifting a complete opposite direction to get the wind in my favor, the landscape looks completely different. And they're like, oh, you should have just looked at topo maps. I'm like, you're looking at a 20-foot contour and a 15-foot hill. Like, everything looks flat on a topo map, and even LiDAR was not accurate. Like, it doesn't capture the nuance of some of those areas. And I would be curious to see, like you said, mountains of Appalachia, or like maybe some bluff country or steep hill country, at least 300, 400 foot elevation change. I'd be really curious to see that, because then you can start to pick it out really well. And man, there's something I've said a lot is I feel like the recipe for making a deer stupid and comfortable is pretty well found. I think we know, don't pressure them, give them food, give them security, and let them live, and go in there and strategically remove one from the face of the earth, and then leave them be again, give them does. And I feel like the recipe for figuring out a deer on his own terms in his own area, while other people are trying to do the same thing, will be debated about until the end of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree there. Jacob, I wanted to stick on this bedding talk real quick. Can you, maybe it's either scroll up or scroll down, maybe it's down. There's a nice little
What are you looking
chart
for?
here. Maybe it's go up, right there, go up. Time spent and behaviors by time of day.
And then there's this by rut phase as well.
Yeah, that's the rut phase there. So what is this, figure 14, figure 15?
Yeah.
So in terms of like bedding, right, this is a nice little visual here. As you get into that early rut, and especially the peak rut here, you can see the changes in time that they're bedding and time that they're actually up moving and walking. So when it comes to, like, if you're like someone that's hunting buck bedding, I never bother with buck bedding during, this time of the year, for this particular reason, right? They're usually up and moving, and I feel like their bedding, in my opinion, is way less predictable during this time of the year. Whereas like early season, let's say we're talking beginning of September around here, like they seem to have a higher fidelity for certain areas, and then I feel like it can go out the window during this time.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, and that is exactly what we see when we look at individual bed sites and bedding areas. So when we look at an individual, well, I guess I should give some definitions first. So an individual bed site is when I say a bed site, I'm referring to an individual bedding bout. So to be considered a bedding bout, that buck needs to be bedded down, relatively stationary for at least an hour. And we're probably excluding some bedding bouts because no one told the bucks that they can't bed down for 15 minutes and be considered a bed. You know what I mean? But for our criteria to be a bedding bout, it's got to be at least an hour, and he's got to be stationary. Now, a bedding area can be multiple bed sites, but they cannot be separated by more than 100 yards from one another. So that's a fairly arbitrary number, but when we were kind of coming up with these criteria, I plotted a bunch of different distance thresholds, 20 yards, 50 yards, 100 yards, 250 yards for all of these bucks on a map, and kind of just visually looked at them and determined which of the ones looked most realistic from a hunter's perspective, as far as isolating a bedding area. So bedding areas can contain multiple bed sites, and a bed site is an individual bedding bout. Now, when we look at kind of the patterns in bed sites throughout the pre-rut to the peak rut to the post rut, we see the exact thing that you just mentioned, where when we get to the pre-rut, let's say pre-rut, bucks are using, they're bedding down a little over 50 times during that 2-week pre-rut interval. So they've got a little over 50 individual beds that they're using. And then when you get to early rut, that number drops way off. And then it stays really low during the peak rut. And then by the time you get to late rut, they're bedding down a lot more, which makes sense, right? They're not as concerned with bedding at that time of year. They're more concerned with breeding and chasing does and doing their thing. The interesting thing about this is what we see with bedding areas is almost the complete opposite. So a buck, his number of distinct bedding areas that he uses increases in a stair-step fashion as we progress through the rut. So he's got more bedding areas in the early rut than he did in the pre-rut. And maybe it's confusing the terminology I'm using. The way we broke down the rut is into 5 2-week intervals. So we've got the pre-rut, which is when virtually no breeding is taking place. We've got the early rut, then we've got the peak rut, and then late, and then post rut. So as we kind of move throughout all 5 of those rut phases, we see the number of unique, distinct bedding areas that a buck is using steadily increasing, while the number of beds, individual bedding bouts, is decreasing. Now, the way that I interpret that, and I'd be curious to hear y'all's thoughts too, the way I interpret that is that as the rut progresses, essentially his search radius is increasing and he is using new, novel bedding areas, because the areas that he had been using are in more of his core area, let's say. And then as, he searches that area, maybe the does that are in that area have already been bred, or none of them are in heat or whatever. He needs to expand his search radius. And as he does, he begins to use new bedding areas. Now, I think where that becomes a real advantage for hunters is, as we all know that as you get to peak rut and you start seeing new bucks, that's when your best chances are of killing a good buck. I'm not saying necessarily relative to like a food cover pattern, but a lot of people kill a lot of bucks during the peak of the rut. And I think what a lot of that comes down to is not just because bucks are clueless and they're running around chasing does, but bucks are in unfamiliar territory. You know what I mean? It'd be like if I walked into one of y'all's houses and you shut off the light and you told me to walk into the kitchen and there's no lights on anywhere. I'd be bumping off of walls and smacking my toe off of tables and running into chairs. But if I was in my own house and you could put me on one end of the house and shut off all the lights, I could easily navigate to the refrigerator in pitch black without running into anything because I know that area. And I think that's a lot of the reason that so many bucks get killed during the peak rut, is because not only are their guards lowered because they're more concerned about chasing does, but their search radius expands and they get out of the areas that they know the best.